Welcome back to another episode of the Enhanced Pod. And on this episode, I am with a man that probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Darryn Berry. He is currently one of the first team physios at the Blue Bulls Rugby team, and obviously working in campaigns like the URC and the Currie Cup. Second to that, he is also a master's degree holder. I met him while we were doing our coursework and masters together at the University of Cape Town. He has been my personal running coach and helped me to run my first ultra marathon, which has been incredible. And on top of being a coach, he's also an incredible multi-sport and endurance athlete in his own right. So we're looking forward to discussing all of these with you, Darryn. But firstly, thank you so much for being here.
No, Nick, thanks. Thanks for having me. And thanks for the introduction. And it's good to be here.
Darryn, I want to dive right in. And if you can share with some of our listeners, what has been your journey into the elite sports space that you currently find yourself in?
I think I started, obviously you go through your ComServe, and then I started in private for the first 6 years of my physio career. So I was based in Nelspruit and then moved to Pretoria, and that was all private work. I was working at sports practices though. And then, through that, being a sports practice in private, you get involved in so I got involved with the Craven Week with the rugby year when I moved to Pretoria. So that's kind of the entry into that sort of system. So from there, the trajectory into elite sports, it literally came to networking and meeting the right people. It was by no means a work your way up the ladder sort of progression. It was who I came across, who I met, and how I networked with those people.
Darryn, I think you've got an interesting story in terms of, I don't know if people necessarily see it as a pathway, but being involved in like junior provincial sport and going from there all the way into like senior and then obviously international club rugby now. Do you think that's a common pathway, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is one of the ways, especially in South African rugby. I think our junior systems are pretty strong. So if you think of the Craven Week and then the South African schools and our junior sort of rugby systems, it's a pretty big industry on itself. And if you are involved in that, like I said, you do meet the right people in those spaces that, especially when it comes to like coaches and other medical staff, that kind of are also moving themselves up into the elite industry within South Africa. So it is a good space to be at junior level. Although I will say that it is not, if you're wanting to get into the more elite industry and the professional industry in senior level, it's not necessary. Let me say that. But it will definitely be a tipping point to steer you in the direction that you need to be going
in. Darryn, you've got a master's degree. How helpful do you find that qualification working in your current elite sports setting?
Yeah, so the masters, obviously we did the coursework and dissertation masters. So I think firstly in doing a masters, the coursework component is probably the number one beneficial thing you can do for that qualification. I think just doing a pure research masters isn't going to give you sort of the edge that you might be looking for from your own development. But then to answer your question, how does it guide you into the industry? You don't need it. I'll just say that straight out. But then on the other hand, I'll say it definitely gives you better conversations when you are in the industry, because I think you learn to think about things differently, especially when it comes to physiotherapy. And I think the way that you sort of approach the general professional rugby space, for example, or cricket or whichever it is, I think you definitely have a different mindset as a result of having gone through a master's process. So you definitely don't need it to get into the industry. I'll repeat that, and I think that's important. But I would recommend it as a thing to make sure that your seat in the industry, you actually have some form of a value for the industry.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really valuable point, and I tend to agree. It's not necessary, but the upside is kind of broadening your mind. I think we've spoken about this. It's more about how it challenges you to think critically and problem solve, which is a lot of what being a physio in elite sports is like, being agile, problem solving, helping you cope with pressure, decisions and situations, and trying to building systems for yourself to try and navigate all those challenges that you face there.
Yeah, correct.
Darryn, quickly, just to kind of round up on the rugby, there's a phrase that I hear a lot in schoolboy rugby. Obviously, I'm also involved in some adolescent, more the school side, not provincial side. But there's a sort of theory that you have to be a rugby physio or a rugby loving person or a rugby previous player or something like that. You've played rugby at a fairly high level post school. Do you think it's necessary, if you want to be in elite rugby, to be from a rugby background, or can you just be a passionate rugby fan, or even just a passionate sports clinician?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. I think there's again a yes and a no answer. So definitely no, you don't need to have played rugby. I think you need to be highly skilled in what you do as a clinician, and I mean that alludes to the previous question with the masters and that. And I think then you can function in any professional space. However, having a passion for the sport and an understanding of the sport is going to be hugely beneficial for you, because one, you know the demands of the sport for the guys when you're treating them. So it helps planning your rehab and your injury prevention, your injury recoveries and your return to play is a lot better, because you understand and you have a desire, you have a feel for what you need to get done. And a lot of the time, if you had played, you've kind of been through those processes before, so you have a feel for what it's actually like. But secondly, I think the biggest thing is it makes you relatable. If you have a bit more of a passion for the actual game and an understanding, but then having played, there's like I said, your clinician-patient relationship is just a little bit stronger, because you can relate to what they're going through. So I would say again, I think it's valuable, but it's not necessary, because when you're in the system, when you're in the industry, as long as you understand the game and the ins and outs, and that you show a desire to understand the demands that the players have to go through, and that's a really interesting thing, is like if you're doing like a return to play, helping with the process, whatever it is, go and hold the contact shields, hold the tackle bags, and actually feel what the players are putting themselves through. And if you haven't ever played the game or you'll very, very quickly appreciate, actually, yes, maybe I need to adjust things. Maybe I need to consider the way I'm approaching things. So I hope that's kind of the best way I would say I can approach it.
I think that's a brilliant answer. I remember when I first started working in school rugby, I had a little bit of background working in rugby at a varsity, like club level and that sort of thing. But I remember at one like captain's practice asking the guys to lift me in the line out as if I was jumping, and just kind of getting a feel for what that actually feels like. How does it work? What are the sort of process of it? And I think of myself as a sports fan, and just remembering, jeepers, there's so much to it that I don't actually think of unless I actually go through the motions. So I love that. Advice of, especially if you're working at a lower level, go hold the contact shields, get involved in the return to play. Sometimes in cricket, we as a staff, we sometimes do the fitness testing with our players as well, so we've got an idea of what they actually have to go through. I think it's great to dive in, and the lower level you're at, the more opportunity you have to do these things. So yeah, I think that's a brilliant piece of advice. Get stuck in and gain the experience firsthand, especially if you haven't played the game at all.
No, hundreds. I was going to say, you mentioned now with cricket was doing the fitness test. So I know in rugby, the standardized thing they do nowadays is the Bronco test. And I mean, just for the sake of being part of it, go and do it one day with the guys. And I promise you'll have a new respect for kind of what their bodies are going through. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think something like that, it's a cool experience to go through, but it also puts into context when you say someone's running a sub-5 Bronco or whatever it is, you can kind of understand what an effort or what a speed that actually feels like for you, and you can kind of put yourself in context against some of your players. So yeah, we encourage everybody to get their hands dirty. Darryn, I want to speak to you a little bit about you're not only a sports clinician, but you're also an endurance coach. Can you give us a bit of a background of how you kind of moved or kind of gained interest in that sort of field?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, when we're doing our master's research, the dissertation part is I actually started my research on junior rugby for the first year and a half, and then that fell by the wayside with the process and data collection. So I kind of had to restart, which wasn't ideal, but we got it done. So I ended up doing my dissertation research on Ironman athletes, so more the endurance world, very different to the rugby world. So I got into that sort of endurance world by one, I was training for triathlon and at that stage. And then I was doing my research on the training load and how it affects amateur athletes in their training processes in terms of injuries and illness. And through that process, got to get a nice understanding. Obviously, we had done the exercise physiology as part of our coursework. And then just adding in the research part and seeing actually, yes, it is relatable. And from there, just decided, yes, it's what I was helping some friends when I was still in Nelspruit with their training. They were prepping for an Ironman 70.3. Had no clue what they were doing. I said, okay, well, let me help you. I've got some background now, and I'm part of my research study now. So I used that as and they found, yes, it was super useful for them. And I was like, okay, cool. Let's give this a try. I think the desire was to have something that wasn't just physio, but still in the sports world. I mean, some people call it your side hustle, your passive incomes. For me, it was another sort of useful tool that I could have to add value to people in the sports world. So then I went through the coaching process to get qualified as a coach for triathlon specific. And then I started building up a brand and a business, and I'm now year 7. Lots changed in 7 years with the coaching and the methods and the whole brand and everything. But it went from research into getting officially qualified as a coach, and then just starting to coach people. And I mean, I remember I had one athlete in Nelspruit. I met him in a bike shop. He was just there, and he was my first athlete. I was getting paid. He was paying me 200 Rand a month to coach him. And he stayed with me for just under 4 years. And eventually we got him to podiums, and we got him to really achieve something. That's how I got into the whole coaching game.
That's actually an incredible story, Darryn. And I didn't realize it's actually been going on for that long. What do you think the understanding and the sort of knowledge around how to coach individual athletes or endurance athletes, what do you think that adds to your skill set as a physio? Because I see a lot of like really good runners and really good endurance athletes pivot into coaching. But I think being a physio, and especially a sports clinician or a sports physio, I think that gives you an even sort of deeper knowledge base to draw on. So I'd be interested to hear, what do you think that adds to your sort of skill set as a physio, or how does that affect your clinical practice?
Yes, it's a deep question to answer. So I'm going to try and summarize it well. So the first part, I'll say you mentioned it now, but I agree with you. So a lot of athletes become coaches, not having had a background and understanding of physiology, training load, the body adaptation, what happens to the organism as you go through a training process. They just understand, I'm going to get fitter, and I know how to make it like that. So it's like there's a performance-driven mindset to coaching that the old athletes go into. Whereas then from my side is having a background physiology, training load, injuries, how does the body adapt, and like the detail of it, the science of it, and how can we get fit in that regard? So, and it's more like a science-based approach. And what's interestingly, I'm currently coaching for a club, and the head coach, the owner of the club, he used to be an athlete. So his drive is performance. And so when we have conversations, it's super interesting where I'll ask him, okay, how are you going to approach this block of training? And he gives all his stuff. And I'm like, it's very different to the way so I'm learning a lot from him in that space where he doesn't go the physiology approach. He goes the performance approach, sort of pulling him up from the end. Whereas my approach is I'm going to push you from behind physiology and get you where you need to go. So it's very interesting. Both you get good results. So there's nothing wrong with them. So to answer your question, then how does it add value for physio? Because, like I said, of the understanding of the physiological demands for someone who, let's say, an amateur runner who's now training and they've got an injury, usually an overuse injury. What it's added value for me is understanding physiology and training and coaching and fitness adaptations. Is one, it's relatable. So I said it with the rugby guys, but it's the same in this world. Is where as a physio, it makes me more relatable to someone who says, listen, I need to do a sub 4 hour marathon in 12 weeks. That's what I was training for. And now I'm injured. I'm like, okay, I know exactly where you are in terms of your training, what you'd need, and how can we, so it's the bigger picture. How can we keep you going, but recovering your injury in the same way? And so when we in undergrad, we taught, listen, function is important and understand but the reality is if you don't know the demands of what a marathon runner has to do to get sub 4 hours physiologically, there's no ways you're going to give them the best solution to recover from the injury and then still get them to their race, for example. So I think the summary is it adds, as a physio, it makes the picture bigger. It makes me relatable to an endurance athlete with an injury, for example, and I feel like you can add more value to their process of recovery than just treating the injury and saying, no, you'll be fine for your race, because you can start adding and removing things that's really going to like stimulate them enough that they will get their goal and they'll recover from the injury. So more, yeah.
I think that's a great answer, Darryn. You're probably being pretty humble in some of you're not selling yourself over the top, but I'll plug your coaching platform and people can connect with you later, because I've gone through that process with you as an athlete, although I'm probably your most mediocre client. But I think some of the things that I enjoyed was even just your coaching prompts around, as someone that has an interest in exercise physiology, sports science, your programming being really, really intentional around, okay, this is a zone 2 run and we're looking for mitochondrial adaptation, and okay, well, you're struggling on the intervals. You actually need to push yourself a little bit harder because we need you to get into this sort of heart rate zone or at this sort of effort level. So just to be on the other end of that and learn, I think sometimes as physios, I don't know if you agree with me here, but we tend to default to like cotton wool and like restrict people, and we take too much away. But especially sort of learning from a lot of my colleagues in rugby specifically, and having a bit of context in cricket and football, I think in rugby you learn that the demands of the sport are actually really high, and you can push athletes, clients, people really hard through the rehab process in also a way that's actually safe for whatever tissue is kind of healing. And the same applies from a training physiological stimulus. You can still train hard, or you can still train with a lot of volume, or you can move to off feet, or you can apply different challenging stimulus without overcooking whatever your main sort of driver is. So
100%,
yeah, I think that's do you have any comments on that about how maybe if you were just a physio and didn't have your knowledge in rugby or in coaching, that about this premise that physios tend to like cotton wool people, and maybe we create chronic rehabbers by restricting loads too much and not really understanding the demands of what we're trying to get people back to?
Yeah. No, 100. So I think you mentioned it a little bit when you were saying now, but the cotton wool wrapping them up, I think it's very prevalent so what having a deeper understanding allows you to look wider and to say, okay, so I'll give you an example of some of the guys now in acute injuries. So we know that if it's an ankle, for example, you're gonna start detraining if you're not being able to sort of run and function at the level you need to pretty quickly. So to widen the load that we want to give you we've taught at undergrad, listen, you need to focus on maintaining their fitness. Okay, but if you don't understand what is going to be the minimal stimulus you need to actually maintain their fitness. Just telling them to go for a light spin on the bike and hope for the best, like it's not really going to help. Whereas say, okay, let's strap a heart rate monitor on. You can work out a guesstimated peak heart rate based off of their age, just using that without doing testing. And then say, okay, so you're not allowed to run, but man, we can put you on the watt bike, or we can put you on the air bike or feet conditioning, as you mentioned, and make sure we hit a certain zone target. And I promise you that guy's going to work, or that patient's going to work and they're going to get a stimulus to maintain fitness from week or from the first day after the injury even, while they're still recovering from the injury. So in that sense, when especially in a performance setup, when it's time to get back to training, is they're not lagging as far as they would have if they were just, as you say, wrapped in cotton wool and said, no, like we can't really do anything, just give it 2 weeks of doing nothing, just recover well. So it's definitely helped in that regard, and I think we can definitely do more for the patients that's in front of you and the athletes that's in front of you if you know how to apply the bare minimal stimulus while still treating the injury. So another comment is I always say, as you know, a zone 2 aerobic effort, whether it's cycling, rowing, running, it's very low intensity. It's boring. It's sometimes boringly low, but you get a lot of adaptation from it if you do a lot of it. And so an acute injury in the first 4 weeks, you've got a lot of time to do that with a patient or an athlete. So why not stimulate them in that correct, exact percentages that they need? It stimulates them mentally, physiologically, and then you're still working on the injury at the same time. So I feel like it's hugely beneficial in that regard.
I think I agree with you so much there that I think physios also need to upskill ourselves on widening that lens and then kind of being aware of what different types of loads we can apply, because I think sometimes we're a bit too quick to just pawn it off to our bios or our S&C sports scientists, but there's a lot of people that might want to be able to advise their clients or patients about these sort of things that work with them in a one-to-one capacity without a multidisciplinary team as well. So I think it's important to know what best practice looks like, and then if you've got other professionals, obviously collaborate, but it all starts with sort of deepening our own understanding of what should be happening or what the body's going through. Something that I've been contemplating a lot recently, with athletes getting injured, either you get a preseason injury or an in-season injury, sort of thinking about what is the time frame wherein deconditioning starts to occur. Because if you take someone out of the middle of your URC campaign, for example, sometimes you can afford to unload them or deload them for a week, depending on what the injury is or depending on what the context is. But there's also a point where you have to kind of cap it, because then they start to tip over and decondition.
Yeah.
What do you think of what are the customer considerations that you guys go through when you're dealing with either guys getting injured in the middle of the season or maybe in the preseason or whatever sort of different phases of the season you might find yourself?
So it's a good question. So here's an interesting thing. I was listening to a podcast the other day from one of the top exercise physiologists. I think he's in Canada. I think he's a Canadian guy. And he was saying they found that your detrainings, and obviously just starting off the response from an endurance athlete point of view. So your detraining of your aerobic function, which will be, so if you want to prescribe it as like your zone 2 sort of training, but your aerobic function of your system is within the first, we always say detraining can happen in the first 2 weeks, but that is speaking more to your anaerobic function of fitness or systems rather than your aerobic function. So the aerobic system actually takes a lot longer to start to detrain. I can't remember the amount of weeks that they started picking up detraining values. So you will lose performance in 2 weeks. And I say 2 weeks because that's generally the amount of time they've found is 2 weeks. You're going to start detraining significantly, but it's not the aerobic function, it's more the anaerobic function. And so that performance, if you just start stimulating the system again, your aerobic function is still there. So practically what that means is if you got an injury mid-season, like you say, we know that within 2 weeks, usually injuries, average recovery at this stage, 4 to 6 weeks for most injuries. You're going to lose your anaerobic function in the first 2 weeks. We know that. And if you've got for example, lower limb injury, there's not much you can do about it from a leg point of view. But in that first 2 weeks, okay, that's going to be the thing we lose quickest. And we know that, especially for a rugby player, is they function with a lot of a high anaerobic system, actually. So if they're doing off-field conditioning, we need to make sure that they are stimulating, if it's, call it air bike with upper body row, stimulating the anaerobic system more than the aerobic system, because we know that in 2 weeks that's going to almost be significantly dropped. The aerobic system, you can get away with saying, listen, for the first 2 weeks, let's just stimulate it a little bit, but we don't need to worry that we're going to lose too much of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a huge amount of sense. I want to just chuck one more question in there selfishly.
Yeah.
In a sport like rugby, with your endurance background, physiology understanding, at a school level, I feel like there's a really high emphasis on like the anaerobic parts of the efforts of rugby. But I want to ask you, how much of a factor, or how important do you think the aerobic base is, especially from a developmental point of view? If you let's say 18, heading to like the 20s sort of age group, how important is it to build a big aerobic base or system if you're a rugby player in that sort of age group?
No, I think that's hugely important. So if you haven't got the engine, you're not going to be able to rev it at a high RPM. So an aerobic base for me is going to build a really big engine for you. So I mean, the physiology, I think I've spoken to you about it, your lactate curves. You're going to shift your lactate curve to one direction. And so essentially your recovery when you are doing anaerobic work is going to be quicker. You'll be able to produce higher efforts at anaerobic work, as long as if your aerobic system is really functioning from, especially at a young age, you keep building it higher and higher and higher, your ability to do top end work becomes more as well. So that's short and sweet answer. That hugely important. Probably more, especially at a younger age, more important than the anaerobic work, because I think the anaerobic system at a younger age can probably function at the level it needs to already, because I mean there's growth hormones, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening, whereas the aerobic system, you really need to spend time doing that to see an adaptation in those systems.
And I think that could be the missing piece. Obviously, at an age group level, sometimes time is the biggest constraint on working with younger athletes. But I love that first point that you said. You're not going to be able to rev your engine well if you haven't built a really big engine to rev. So I think it kind of comes down to that. For me, aerobic function in the athletes that I sort of see, especially at schools level, I think that sometimes is a limiting factor for the amount of anaerobic, or even sometimes their power output, or their ability to produce that over the time span of their match or the time span of their season. So yeah, it's a challenge to find time for it, but I think if we believe that it's important, we've got to make the time. Darryn, just to sort of round out.
Can I interrupt you? Just one thing. So one thing we're obviously measuring here with the players is that obviously where the GPS belts and everything's tracked in that sense. So it's hard data. And our sports scientist, he's really trying to get heart rate vests onto the guys as well. It's just super uncomfortable for them, so they don't like to train or play with them. So everything is GPS at the moment. And what would be interesting, because I don't think it's out there at the moment, especially for rugby and at a school level, even with the younger guys, to see what are the physiological demands actually. So because if you take an 80-minute game, is a lot of time is spent sort of coasting around, moving around the field, and then you're bursting into an effort, and then you're recovering again. And so how much aerobic work is actually being done and how much is anaerobic? Is it like a 90%, 10% split of 90% aerobic, 10% really hard anaerobic work? Your heart rate will give you a pretty good indication of what sort of work you're doing. Whereas currently now it's all based off on GPS. So I think it's just an interesting thing for the future that I know our sports scientist, like I said, is trying to sort of measure. Just trying to get the guys to wear the belts is the difficult thing.
I think that's a great point. If I can just add a cricket analogy in there, I think we sort of switched some of our conditioning, especially for bowlers, to really include a huge volume of maximal aerobic speed running, especially. We've like lengthened our preseason as well. We've increased the volume of that year on year, and it's made such a big difference to the capacity of our bowlers to tolerate loads. And I think it helps build more sort of robust athletes as well. But like you say, it's boring. It takes time. It takes consistency. You don't see the results immediately. It's easy to make guys sweat and almost throw up, but the real meaningful thing is to actually build them a massive engine that can tolerate lots of high intensity efforts and allow them to recover really well in between those efforts. So there's a huge physiological underpinning that I think as physios, sports scientists, sports clinicians in this space, I think we have to really keep singing from this hymn sheet and preaching it as much as we can, because we know that it's it's such an important piece. Darryn, I just want to, before we round out, I want to just ask you quickly. I know you've spoken to me a little bit about your multidisciplinary team at the Bulls, and you've given your bio a lot of praise and credit for being really knowledgeable and insightful and innovative in the way that they manage some of the rehab, especially around ACLs. We've chatted around ACLs. Just talk to me about the importance of being a good team member in a multidisciplinary team, and then what are some of the things that you feel that you guys do really well that clinicians in other settings can maybe try and take and emulate to improve outcomes, one as a multidisciplinary team, but also for your athletes and patients under your care?
Yeah. No, yeah, Nick, that's good. So our system, we have obviously physio and bio and strength conditioning, and then obviously our sports scientists. So the team's pretty big, and the player has to go through a full process until he's ready to play. The functioning of that team is hugely critical to actually a successful process of return to play. If there's anyone in the system that decides to be more important than the team, the whole system is going to fail. I have seen that. So the setup to function well, everyone needs to be part of the process. And so, yeah, we've got a good process. Like you said, our bio does all the in-depth rehab, super up to date and really just always challenging new thoughts and new ideas, which is good. And I think for me, from a physio point of view, what's nice is what's worked is we start with rehab in that rehab process as quick as we can, as soon as we can in the process. Obviously, I think that in the private world, it's obviously always how much physio. I mean, our scope of practice is extensive, so we can go the full length of time. And as long as you're qualified and sort of your clinical skills are up to date to be able to do that. Whereas here it's like, listen, we need to say, no, I'm not going to carry on right until return to play because we've got a system. So as soon as we are ready to get into a full rehab process, you need to shift the player in there. So we try and get even from week one, we try and get the bio involved with doing something that's of value to the injury and to the process. So that I don't know, let's call it week 4 to 6, we're already shifting the play into a full rehab process. And then what's nice for us then from a physio side is there's certain baselines that we just continue working on while they're fully in rehab. There's certain sort of movement and control things that we can still be doing while they're fully in rehab. And what I've seen that does is it brings our return to play time down a lot because we start the rehab process a lot earlier. So a huge collaborative approach. Everyone's got their own way of thinking about rehab and the body and the processes. And the picture comes really nicely together when everyone understands that this is what I bring to the process. And then what the other people bring and say, let's let you do that as early on and let you have full freedom to do that. So that's been really useful for us.
I think it's great that you summarized it as a really collaborative approach, because I think it can differ depending on settings, but I think understanding the skill sets and the interests and maybe the resources of all the different clinicians in your setting, and then how to tap into those to get the best outcome for your athletes, and kind of putting egos and things aside and figuring out how are we going to get the best outcome here, and obviously improve the time to return to play, and then also make sure that return to play is happening with as low risk of re-injury as possible.
Yeah. So he has a number for you. I mean, we could kind of keep injury stats, and our time lost return to play, the average duration. So we're sitting at 36 days for the URC season, which is, what's that, about 5 weeks, somewhere between 5 and 6 weeks. If my math is correct, so about 5 weeks. So
Okay.
I think last season we were at 42, so that's come down a few days. Obviously, the type of injuries affects that. Um,
Yeah.
and I can see that if there wasn't a system that was collaborative, that number would probably be closer to the 8 week mark in terms of an average time frame, just because of the nature of the injuries that we've had. So yeah, it's just working off of averages. It's been a good thing.
I want to squeeze one more in there quickly before we close up,
Yeah.
Darryn, because you opened the door now. I've got to walk through it. How important do you feel like it is for physios at any level, even if you're a club physio volunteering, how important is it to kind of document and look at, I want to say, kind of calculating the burden of your injuries year on year? How important do you think that is?
No, it's hugely important. So I'll use an example to show how important it is. Last season, URC season, our highest burden of injury was hamstring strains. It was a huge, and it opened up a lot of conversation of how we're preventing, how we're training, and a lot of the time we don't do anything to fix it. We sort of the SNC staff then look at how do they need to adapt their load planning strategies for the field sessions to. So, for example, what we do now, the guys sprint once a week. They do a 90% max sprint and our hamstring strain burden has come down significantly this year. This year we're struggling with a lot of joint issues. So then we now need to say, yes, what's changed that we now have a lot of joint issues and low back issues as being our highest burden of injury. So to come back to your question, if you don't have that data and that sort of recollection and trends, one, you can't have conversations with your team. And secondly, like you don't really know what's actually happening within your player and your system. So when you get new players in, you can we can screen. Listen, we know hamstrings and knees and ankles. That's our biggest thing we need to screen for. Shoulders is not a huge thing for us. So a new player comes in, we screen for those, do the right testing, and say, okay, listen, we're happy. There's maybe a few things to work on, but generally he can go full steam, and we're happy with that. So it just allows you to be really on top of what's happening with your players, and then you can have you can have the conversations with the coaches more meaningfully and say, listen, be careful of this season. Think about this. We're heading into this part of the season. Be careful of this. Like it just makes conversation a lot more better.
Darryn, thank you so much for sharing all your insights with us today and even giving us a little bit of a peek of some of the thoughts and processes that you are kind of applying at a world and global sort of campaign like the URC. That's incredible, and I really appreciate it so much. We're going to wrap it up there, but what I will do for everybody is once we start posting this on socials and even in the description for the pod, I will include your handle so people can connect with you, follow you. You've got a lot of really interesting stuff, whether you want to be coached by Darryn as an endurance athlete or just sort of follow along for the career. Darryn Berry on all his social platforms. I'll send the link. And then just a massive, massive thank you for sharing your time and knowledge and insights with us. I really appreciate it. I think we have to have a follow-up in maybe in another season, or once you get a little bit of a break, we can unpack some more things. But yeah, I really appreciate your time, Darryn.
No, good. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me. And yeah, keep up with pushing physio into new horizons. It's a good thing you got. So well done, and thank you for that.